All right, so here we go. Here I'm going to talk about the history of icon veneration from Second Temple Judaism, the Old Testament, and the Apostles. I'm going to put it all together at the end. So when we look at Second Temple Judaism, I'm going to look at Second Temple Jewish art, estates that were around the Herodian period, how Jews treated their deceased saints, and then even synagogues during the time of Christ. So in Second Temple Judaism, we know from the Bet Sharim necropolis that there's here, and this was used by Robin Jensen in her book, From Idols to Icons, that they have here an image in this kind of burial site, this necropolis, of two lions devouring a bull, and this is dated to the 3rd century BCE. So my point here is not, oh, okay, yeah, so they were bowing and kissing to images, the Jewish people. No. But the idea that like the Jewish people had no graven images, except in the temple. Well, no, they had images, and they used images even when they were commemorating the tombs of their dead loved ones. Similarly, when we look at the use of images in houses in the Second Temple period, in Jack Finnegan's classic work, The Archaeology of the New Testament, he mentions how in the Herodian period they have found houses with mosaics of birds. He says here, birds on a stylized architectural floral background, right? And he says here at the end, the excavators remark that the presumably wealthy residents evidently allowed themselves to be lax in respect of the prohibition against graven images. But what if the prohibition against graven images was never that strict? What if there was some context here that the Jews of this period were properly picking up on so that they could have images, and they could even have graven images that weren't eidolons, weren't idols themselves? All right. Moving on then, we see in Matthew 23, 29 to 30, Jesus says of the Pharisees the following. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs for the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous. And you say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Notice what Jesus just said here. In Second Temple Judaism, in the time of Jesus, of the Pharisees, they built tombs for prophets and they decorated the monuments of the righteous. They used art to commemorate the righteous, to commemorate their saints. They used art. Now, to quote from W.D. Davies and Dale Allison's Commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, Volume 3, page 304, they say, quote, our sources tell us about several well-known tombs and elaborate monuments. For example, in 1 Maccabees 13, 27 to 30, memorials built over tombs by Simon Maccabee for his family. Josephus in Antiquities mentions, monuments that were built. The tomb of David, which is mentioned in Acts 2:29. I think it's Peter speaking there, and he says that we know, basically that where the tomb of David is. That's alluding to this cult of venerating saints in Second Temple Judaism, venerating understood broadly here. And they have the grave sites. And similarly, as I mentioned with William Horbury's quote on how the ancient Jews would have festivals, readings of scripture, they would assemble around the tombs. This was part of the cult of saints. They did these sorts of things, building monuments, decorating the tombs. And you'll even see further veneration of the tombs themselves. And so even in the War of the Jews, he mentions tombs of fine marble and exquisite workmanship alleged to belong to Abraham and his kin. So in honor of the saints, they built these great tombs. And then even there's a scholar named Joachim Jeremias who talks about how there were an upsurge of tomb buildings during the Hellenistic period, the Second Temple Jewish times of the apostles. And I want to quote actually then the sources that are mentioned, like 1 Maccabees 13, 27 to 30. It says here that, and Simon built a monument over the tomb of his father and his brothers. He made it high so that it might be seen with polished stone at the front and back. He also erected 7 pyramids opposite one another for his father and mother and 4 brothers. For the pyramids he devised an elaborate setting, erecting about them great columns. And on the columns he put suits of armor for a permanent memorial. And beside the suits of armor he carved ships so that they could be seen by all who sail the sea. This is the tomb that he built in Modane. It remains to this day. That's incredible. Further on, going to Josephus in the War of the Jews, he says, they further relate that it was there that Abraham, the progenitor of the Jews, took up his abode after his migration from Mesopotamia, and from there that his posterity went down into Egypt. Their tombs are shown in this little town to this day of really fine marble and of exquisite workmanship. Okay, so, the use of art and images in some sense was there, even carving ships to commemorate those who have been deceased. And then similarly here in Ayel Regev's recent work, scholarly work, this might be her article or his article from in the 2006, Ancient Jewish Style, Why Were Ossuaries and Southern Oil Lamps Decorated? He writes, quote, note that burial in ossuaries in general was widespread in the Herodian period. Remember, that is between 37 BCE and 73 CE. And a few thousand ossuaries are recorded. The various degrees of quality and aesthetics of the ossuaries, carving and decoration, may indeed reflect some degree of social status. However, expensive mortuary practices do not necessarily represent actual social status. He quotes a scholar who has shown that a deceased person may have frequently been buried as a distinguished person, although they were just a commoner in life. Furthermore, the decorations on the ossuaries belonging to members of high priestly and noble families are not outstanding in comparison to many others. And then he quotes some specific examples. For example, the Caiaphas ossuary, which probably is more just Joseph's son of Caiapha. It says that it had the most complex and rich variation on the theme of the rosette, a kind of wheel-like depiction of a flower. But my point here then is that Jews, when they were burying their loved ones and even commemorating their saints, they brought out exquisite art and workmanship in order to remember them. And then they would assemble at the tombs. This was part of the cult of saints. So in the one sense, you could say then that art did have a cultic use. What cult was it? The cult of the saints in ancient Judaism. Similarly, R.T. France, in his commentary on Matthew, he says, the veneration of tombs, of holy people and martyrs, these tombs that were decorated and exquisite and decked with jewels and maybe other carvings, is a feature of Jewish as of many other cultures. Lives of the Prophets, probably written in the 1st century AD, makes a point of mentioning where each of the prophets was buried, except, of course, Elijah, and indulges in detailed description of some of their times. He then says in a footnote, Josephus speaks of the visiting of the tombs of the patriarchs in Hebron and of their significance. In Antiquities, he speaks of a very expensive white marble monument erected by Herod, who would have been identified as a Jew, at the entrance to David's tomb, though in this case the motive was guilt rather than piety. See also Antiquities for further or earlier Jewish practice, and he quotes here First Maccabees. And then he quotes Joachim Jeremias, whose work is only in German at the moment, where he summarizes his study, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the German, where he speaks of a tomb renaissance, which flourished at the time of Jesus. So during the time of Jesus, during the time of the apostles, there was this cult of the veneration of saints, and the tombs are mentioned, and the tombs would have been decorated. They would have been venerated, the tombs of the prophets, of the holy people and martyrs. I mean, even in Matthew's gospel, it mentions how after the resurrection of Jesus, other prophets and holy men and women were resurrected and appeared in the city. The tombs were opened. So the gospels, if you read them in their Jewish context, they are aware of this tomb veneration cult, if you will, of the saints. Similarly, Cassius Dio, writing his Roman history, describing, I think, the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, he says, thus nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. This is going into the 2nd century, a result of which the people had forewarning before the war. For the tomb of Solomon, which the Jews regard as an object of veneration, fell to pieces of itself and collapsed, and many wolves and hyenas rushed howling into their cities. Notice what it's saying here. In the 2nd century, the Jews were venerating the tomb of Solomon as an object of veneration. And I would even say further, I mean, obviously, what the veneration exactly was, we don't know. At least some type of decoration, assembly, right, in that cult of the veneration of saints, of their saints. But still, this is significant because if the Jews are doing this in the 2nd century, it's not a far stretch to think that Christians would see their Jewish brothers and say, oh, well, they wouldn't, let's say, be so far off from their Jewish brothers and sisters in this regard. To move on then to a synagogue during the time of Jesus, this is probably where, well, we don't know for certain, but maybe because this is located in Magdala, that this might be where Mary Magdalene went as a young girl to synagogue. We see that in that synagogue, there were images, carved images of a rosette, of columns, flowers, of pottery there. You can see the top picture. And in a lot of these Jewish ossuaries and the necropolis that I mentioned earlier, and in synagogues and so on and so forth, you would see an image of a menorah. And that menorah, generally speaking, scholars believe might have represented like a guiding light in the afterlife, something like that. But the point is that it was a symbol, right? And you see these symbols here in the synagogues themselves. So the Jews of the Second Temple period, you don't want to generalize too broadly here, so be careful with that. But at least even among someone like Mary Magdalene, right? Someone who is a saint, someone who is loved by the early church, the synagogue she grew up in had images. Interesting. Now I want to go into the Old Testament to then also build up then the foreground, or the background rather, for the idea of icon veneration. So remember in Joshua chapter 7, verse 6, Joshua, after this defeat, he tore his clothes and fell to the ground on his face before the ark of the Lord until the evening. There goes thunder. But he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their heads. Now, Gavin says in response to this example, but this is an act of mourning in response to a military defeat. It's not a continual religious practice of venerating the ark, just as, for example, this one-off event of, let's say, King David dancing in front of the ark doesn't mean that liturgical dancing is now a firm principle of liturgy. We can't use a one-off event, Gavin says, like this to support an ongoing practice when the one-off event is occasioned by a very specific set of circumstances, especially when the text itself never talks about the ark being the specific object of veneration, as opposed to it being the occasion for mourning before God, since the ark represents the presence of God. There are just no examples of the people venerating the ark. Well, I do have something to say in response, and I investigated this one-off claim, and I found that the practice of praying toward the ark did continue. It wasn't a one-off event, although it changed once the temple was built. Jerusalem and the temple become symbols of the divine presence to which people prayed, and I'd even add they bowed. In other words, the cult of God included praying to the temple and bowing to the temple and Jerusalem. Let me provide the evidence. So first, in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 44, Solomon is addressing the Israelites, and he says, when your people go out to battle against their enemy, and this is similar then to the context of actually Joshua, right? Because this was in the context of a military struggle. By whatever way you send them, and they pray to the Lord toward the city which you have chosen, and the house which I have built for your name. I think this is an allusion in some way to Joshua, right? Because Joshua, after this defeat, he prays before the ark. And then Solomon's saying, yes, and when we go into battle, God, your people, they can pray towards the city and towards the house that I have built for your name. In verse 48, he says, if they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies, who have taken them captive, and pray to you toward their land, which you have given to their fathers. Okay, notice it's, and pray to you, right? The city which you have chosen, and the house which I have built for your name. The temple was an object that was prayed to. Similarly, in 2 Chronicles 6:34, it says, when your people go out to battle against their enemies, by whatever way you send them, and they pray to you towards this city, which you have chosen, and the house which I have built for your name. Now, somebody might say, but Suan, this is praying to God. It's not praying to the temple. Well, I mean, the text says that you are praying to God by praying to the temple, which is interesting then. But still, this is, I think, getting the ball going. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 10, we see similarly that Daniel prayed facing the east. And in fact, even into rabbinic Judaism, this practice known as Mizrah, of praying to the east, of remembering Jerusalem, of praying to the temple, that had continued. And even I think Michael has mentioned how the apostles, probably as pious Jews, would have prayed facing east towards the temple as well. In Psalm 5, 7-8, it says, "But I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house. I will bow down toward your holy temple in awe of you. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me." The temple was prayed to and bowed toward in awe of God, in honor of God. And so remember once again that when we think about the temple, this temple, this house for God that was built by King Solomon, he received the designs from David and then he instituted them. This temple that was made by human hands, that was made and filled with images inside of them. You would see Jews praying and bowing to that temple. Surely that's something. Surely that doesn't, that gets the ball going on maybe icon veneration isn't, as Gavin had said, having no foundation. And now, admittedly, this is not exactly like icon veneration, right? I mean, think about it. The presence of the saint is not in the icon, whereas God was in some sense in the temple and Jerusalem. This isn't a controversial point among Old Testament scholars. Somehow on the mercy seat, God dwelled, in the Ark of the Covenant between the two cherubim, right? Now, maybe that's anthropomorphic, something like that, but still, God's divine presence was somehow more acutely, if we can put it that way, in the temple and in Jerusalem. However, it is like icon veneration in that the cultic action of bowing and praying towards a man-made artifact is being regularly done. That is the temple or Jerusalem more broadly. Now, the temple is not the end in itself. Ultimately, it's to God that the prayer and the awe and the honor to the temple is being directed. Veneration principle. But it does become a representation of the divine presence. It becomes glued in Jewish memory. The temple is the symbol of the divine presence, of God's favor towards us. Similarly, an icon is not the end in itself, but a representation of the saint. So you could say that we pray toward the icon, we bow toward the icon, but it's to the saint and ultimately to God. Just as with the Old Testament Israelites, they bowed and prayed to the temple, but it was ultimately towards God. And so my point here is that simply, this is starting to get dangerously close to Nicaea II. I think there's something here that's going on. I'm sure for me as a Protestant, if I read this and saw this, I would have been amazed. They were bowing and praying to the temple, but I thought the Jews would, never do something like that. I thought they were opposed to, they had images because they were allowed to, but they wouldn't bow and pray to the temple. They did. And so let's explore this phenomenon a bit further. How do we get to this point in Israelite history where people are regularly praying and bowing to man-made objects that house the divine presence? Well, in the Old Testament, the boundary between the divine and creation began to narrow as the Israelites made it out of Egypt into the Promised Land, and then finally you have the institution of the Davidic monarchy. When the barrier, the boundary between the divine and creation began to narrow, this had consequences for the cult of God and the Israelite monarchy. So let me give the biblical history of this to illustrate my point. In Deuteronomy 17:14-20, Moses prophesies that the Israelites will have a king or have kings, and he gives instructions. Okay, so from the very beginning, Moses knew that the monarchy that is to come, that is part of the plan of God. That is part of the evolving or unfolding history of God's plan. Now look at this. In 1 Chronicles 29:20, it says this, "Then David said to all the assembly, 'Now bless the Lord your God.' And all the assembly blessed the Lord, the God of their fathers, and bowed down and paid homage to the Lord and the king." Hold on. If I were a Protestant here, I'd be panicking because, and I'm not trying to be mean, but I'm trying to say here that in the same act of worshiping God, of bowing to God, they are bowing to King David as well. Sorry, that's getting too close, right? Well, I mean, doesn't that remind you of some objections that, when you bow to an image of, let's say, an icon, that's too close to bowing to how pagans bow to the images of their gods? But the thing is, the reason why it's legitimate is because God is uniting himself to creation. He's becoming closer to his people. And so because of that, because of the boundary between the divine and creation is closing, that has consequences for the cult. That has consequences for the veneration of human beings. And I want to thank Brianna Elise Jangsky for bringing this to my attention. But even further then, Let's look at Psalm 45:1. My heart is moved with a good theme. I address my verses to the king. And Old Testament scholars, for example, one of my professors at Harvard, Shia Cohen, he argues, yeah, the king here is the Israelite monarch. He says, your throne, God. Oh, is he talking about God in heaven? No, he's referring to the king as God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of justice. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, addressing the king, your God has anointed you with the oil of joy above your companions. Notice here what's going on. The king is referred to as God, just as in the same act, the Israelites, when they bowed to God, they bowed to King David at the same time. What's going on here is that the gap between creation and the divine is closing. It almost, well, it does prefigure the incarnation and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so here, notice then that this has consequences for what can be done with images and ordinary things like human beings, like the king, or man-made things like the temple. We can start, as the divine presence gets closer to them, bowing and praying to them. And so even when you look at the Old Testament monarchy, I mean, just some archaeology here, at the top you see the seal of King Hezekiah. King Hezekiah, who is known for destroying Nehushtan, right, the bronze serpent, this supposedly maybe, I don't know, I don't want to say Gavin saying this, but some people might say a champion of iconoclasm or aniconism. His seal had the winged sun on it, which was a symbol that you see throughout the ancient Near East, of like omnipotence and power, and the Ankh on both sides. Similarly, the seal of Eliakim, my boy Eliakim, has two does on it, right? So you had images now outside of the temple before, right? Well, I'll hold that off. But look, there were permissible images outside of the temple, even images that weren't directly divinely commissioned, but allowed. So what this shows to me then is that when the Davidic monarchy was finally instituted and God's temple was built and he was dwelling with his people, the boundary around images, that began to shift. Things began to change. And then you could start making your own images and having, things like this. And so I quote here from a scholar in his essay on the Second Commandment and the image in Judaism. But the point I'm making here of Joseph Gutman's argument is that the erection of the Solomonic temple marked the consolidation of a new phase in Jewish history, right? Things were changing, things were moving. Whereas before, it would be unthinkable to make these graven images, to do this sorts of thing. Now under Solomon, once God had found his king, once God had identified himself, and the cult of God and the cult of the Israelite monarch overlapped, things began to change. And so, once there was a secure kingdom and the cult could be protected by the king, when they weren't any longer in the desert and they could be potentially subject to all kinds of influences. But once Israel was secure, the cult changed. The cult developed. The cult moved now into praying and bowing towards the temple because it has the divine presence, unlike the golden calf. And in fact, I'd say probably that the golden calf, I mean, aside from the problem of the fact that they treated it as if it were God himself, God was saying perhaps, no, you're going to get to be able to pray and bow towards a man-made artifact and thereby honor me, but this isn't how you do it. I think that's what's going on. And so remember in Exodus 25, outside the promised land or Mount Sinai, Moses could only make images that God expressly commanded. And then in Canaan, Joshua could pray before the ark without scandal. And then once we get to Jerusalem, David was allowed to design the temple himself and hand it to his son Solomon. And then the Israelites could then bow and pray towards the temple without scandal. Notice here how things are changing. There's a progression here. And so to illustrate this in a chart, as the heaven and earth were narrowing, we see in the beginning images only if God commands them, according to his exact instructions, right? He's very particular about what Moses can do, how he can build it. He's kind of holding Moses' hand, if you will. So now, okay, we can pray before the Ark of the Covenant. We can design the temple, right? Because God doesn't explicitly give the design of the temple. Rather, he allows David the freedom now to make and design a house for him, but with divine permission, divine commissioning. And then eventually, where does that move to? Bowing and praying towards the temple with images inside. Images are also allowed now outside of the temple by one's own design and without divine commission. The fence around images began to increase over time. What happens to the cult of images? once God incarnate has conquered death? Once the veil in the temple has been torn, the division between heaven and earth? What happens once God incarnate has rebuilt David's kingdom? What happens to images? This is a valid theological principle or question that gets us then into the question of the cult itself. And so, I mentioned here a little bit about Nehushtan and the bronze serpent. I just want to say very briefly that, in order to avoid a contradiction, you can't interpret the first commandment and the second commandment apart from each other. If you do, then there is a contradiction. Let me continue then with the question, the apostles, how did they venerate icons? So the first thing to point out is historically, art was usually expensive, like good art. But you can make art with vulgar tools. So, there's the possibility that they could still have had art, but maybe it wasn't like a grand monument like some of the Jews had built, like some of the pagans had for their own deities, right? Maybe the art was maybe not so well made. And if that's the case, then it would have disappeared over time due to erosion or just simply being lost to the historical record. Similarly, to avoid the argument from silence that, for example, if Christians were venerating images, then we would expect someone to be exasperated and say something. I would argue then that if we're going to do this historical reconstruction, the early Christian image veneration can't look too different from their surroundings, right? Now, somebody might say here, well, Suan, that's not positive evidence that they actually had images that they were venerating. And remember, venerating in this broad sense of even acknowledging that they had a sacred use or using in the cult of the saints and thereby having a cultic use. But the thing is, even people who defend the Exodus, Old Testament scholars, they will say that, well, it makes sense why we wouldn't have evidence of a movement of 1 to 3 million people in the Sinai desert, because maybe they had cheap materials, the clothing would have perished easily, there have been wars in the desert, things like that. My point similarly here then is I'm trying to make sense of, well, why don't we, let's say, have, if they were venerating images, right, then why don't we see like people, panicking? And it's probably because the apostles and the early church venerated images in a way that their Jewish brothers and sisters and their Gentile brothers and sisters wouldn't have been too surprised by. In other words, here are some scenarios that I want to actually give. The early Christians, I'm arguing, probably venerated and decorated the tombs and relics of their saints. These tomb decorations are perhaps the prototype of icons. The tomb was decorated or was venerated with decorations there. And as we saw on ossuaries and other sculptures, you could have the image of a menorah, birds, a rosette, something that represented the saint or the person who was deceased as part of the cult of the saint. Similarly, early Christians, I could imagine, mourned the deceased, holding on to relics or other visible reminders of them. Remember the example I gave of Leontius of Neapolis, if I'm saying that right, where he talked about how there are all kinds of different ways where you can venerate something, weeping, holding on to something. And I even would imagine that during Eucharistic celebrations in house churches, during the Thanksgiving sacrifice, during the liturgy, they were remembering these deceased loved ones, these saints like Stephen, and they held on to their relics, or maybe they held on to other visual reminders of them, like their cloak. Remember, it's a visible object that directs the eyes of the mind to the form, the saint themselves. And even in Tobit chapter 4, verse 17, it says, "Pour out your food and your wine on the grave of the righteous, but do not give it to sinners." So even there, the grave itself can be receiving certain things. And I could see this as being maybe part of the Eucharistic, maybe there's some Eucharistic imagery here that the early Christians would have picked up on. In 3, we see here the early Christians also reinterpret pagan images for Christian purposes, with some images like the Good Shepherd gaining widespread traction in the cult. And so, to quote from Laura Nasrallah, in her book, Christian Responses to Roman Art and Architecture, she says, "It is also clear that Christians from the very start used commonly available images from the very start and applied their own meanings to them. According to Clement, the same Clement who talks about rotting away with your idols, a signet ring picturing a ship properly understood can be a Christian symbol." So in other words, why don't we see maybe early artifacts made by Christians? Because they were using, excuse me for the sound, they were using already the artifacts that they had from their surrounding culture. And I even want to mention here Matthew 22:21 and Mark 12:17, when Jesus took a pagan image, that is the coin of Caesar, oh, there we go, and made a valid theological point out of it, right? Jesus said that whose image is on this coin? Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, render unto God what belongs to God. Jesus took this pagan image and reversed it into making it a valid theological point. And I could see early Christians then, by inspiration from the Lord, following the example of the Lord, taking pagan images and reinterpreting them into the Christian cult. Now, what is a valid doctrinal development? To not get too specific into, people like, St. John Henry Newman and others, simply a teaching or principle whose truth value does not change, but its reception or understanding does. So, for example, with a doctrine like the Trinity was always there in the New Testament, but the understanding developed, right? That's how I would explain the development of the doctrine of the Trinity, as there was better kind of understanding of the divine nature, how to precisely put the categories together, that built up over time into eventually a more precise articulation of the doctrine that was always true. Now, as the Catholic brothers pointed out, cultic development is distinct somewhat from doctrinal development in that cultic development follows from doctrinal development. So to give an example, with something like Eucharistic adoration, the underlying doctrine of Eucharistic adoration is transubstantiation, is the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And then in the cult, what we can do with that doctrine then is we can also adore and worship the Eucharist without fear, because it is, Jesus Christ himself. So notice that the underlying doctrine can justify later, let's say, developments in the cultic circle of having adoration there, of having the Eucharist being adored in a distinct way. In other words, the doctrine remained the same, but it was what changed over time was the external manifestation in the cult. But what you need is that doctrine, that principle that is unchanging. Because remember, when something changes, it doesn't radically rupture each time. When something changes, there is one stable substance, but let's say outward accidents begin to change and develop, but the substance is the same. And so I use, for the example, in my last presentation on icons and doctrinal development, the example of a Polaroid. And so let's look at these things. The arguments of Nicaea II. The incarnation of Christ was always true. And that being the case, the incarnation was always, let's say, poised and ready to respond to Gnostic and pagan, and Platonic objections against the visible and material world. And moreover, art would have that valid purpose of reinforcing the reality of Christ's flesh. Because, for example, imagine if we held what Hyria said, and we, held that, okay, yeah, Jesus was incarnate, he is the incarnate Lord, but he's the invisible God, and we won't have any images depicting Jesus in his humanity. Wouldn't that cause problems? Because, we want to affirm that Jesus Christ was really human, but we make him invisible in our liturgy. There's a conflict there. So art has the purpose of reinforcing the reality of Christ's flesh. This has immediate cultic relevance and value. So similarly, then you could go from the doctrine and a valid statement on what should the cult reflect in that. So then, yes, of course, images of Christ then would have perfectly fine place in the liturgy. In terms of apostolicity, the authorization to create and use sacred art is of apostolic origin. And so I'd say this just simply gives the practice validity from the start, that not only that art can be sacred, but it is endorsed by the apostles. There's the argument from indefectible identity. But it's really, I think, the veneration argument that since image veneration is a valid extension of saint veneration, because both relics and icons direct the eyes of the mind to the form, to the saint, saints can be venerated through their images. I think this is when you combine 1, 2, and 4. I mean, I think 3 just seals the deal, but 1, 2, and 4, you get Nicaea II. In other words, images were always used in the Christian cult, especially for saint veneration. Hence, they always had a cultic use. What changed over time were the specific cultic uses of images, but still in that cult of saints. In Exodus chapter 18, verse 7, Moses, he meets his father-in-law and he bows down and kisses him, and they're reconnecting. And I think there's this beautiful image here of how Moses venerating someone who is living, of honoring him, of loving him, of reconnecting with him. I mean, that's what we do in the liturgy as Catholics. When we enter into that chapel, when we enter into that sacred temple, and we enter into that space, we're reconnecting with the saints triumphant in heaven. We're reconnecting. We're entering into this sacred space that is taking us up to heaven. And so in a beautiful way then, when we kiss and bow to the images of the saints, we're doing what Moses did. We're not honoring something dead, something no longer living. No, the saints are living. And so we can transfer our kisses and our bows of honor towards them. This is, I think this is a biblical practice. And so when I now chart the more complete picture of icon veneration, I think ancient Israel set us up for venerating artifacts and persons who were close to God. And then in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, we see already the cult of saints, this idea of creating monuments, of doing liturgical practices, not just in the synagogue, but outside of the synagogue, in your daily life, right? The cult is not just what's going on in the synagogue, it's the community's life. It goes even beyond the synagogue to your everyday life, to the little devotions and practices you do. That's how wide the cult is. So there was art in the cult of saints, and hence there was always cultic use of art, even in the Second Temple and early Christian period. And then from there, using that veneration principle of Basil and Athanasius, you can then expand based on that doctrine of the validity of veneration of saints and the ability to use art to venerate them, the ways in which you venerate the icon to ultimately venerate the saint. So I want to say once again that this is what I think is the consistent principle. Art in the cult of saints, and hence there was always a cultic use of art. And then over time, what happens is the substance is there, that remains unchanging. And then the veneration principle gets us to ask, well, if we can bow and kiss living figures, or excuse me, living persons, and the saints are living persons, then can we bow and kiss the saints through the images? And the answer is yes. Before we end today's episode of Intellectual Catholicism, I do have one last thing to say and to share, and so let's do that real quick.
Hi, I'm Father Michael Lee. I am the administrator of St. Luke Byzantine Catholic Church in Sugar Creek, Missouri. And I just wanted to appeal to you today to pray about helping us in our moving project. I've been the administrator of St. Luke for the last 5 years, and in that time we basically have doubled our size. We went from a congregation of kind of the low 30s up almost into the 80s. And we're just really trying to find a new space where we can expand and grow and offer this beautiful apostolic brand of Christianity to anybody that wants to come. So we were just appealing for your help. If you would like to get in and help us to move and to grow and to be able to have this unique and beautiful expression of Catholicism, please visit our website. It's byzantinekc.org. And on the landing page, there's a donate button that will take you to another website that you can donate electronically. We really appreciate anything that you can do, and we're praying for you. God bless.